Awesome. So again, thanks guys for getting me back on. I really appreciate it. And thanks for giving up your time. So today I'm going to talk about lake fishing, approaching lake fishing, both from a boat and land based. And we were going to we could break these down into a series, and pretty much it's too much to talk about both streamer fishing, nymph fishing, dry fly fishing, all in one presentation. We'll be here for hours. So today I was going to focus on streamers and wet flies. In Victoria, realistically, or in Australia in general, that's pretty much 80%, 90% of what we do. Like, especially in Victoria, that's in competitions, that's the way people generally fish because it's the most effective way to fish. And in most conditions, that is. So we'll focus on streamers and wet flies. Next week, we'll do nymphs. So if you're, I did a similar presentation to this last week for the Calder Club, and a few of those guys were, at the end, were asking me questions about nymphs and dries and how that fills in. So just to give you the heads up now, we'll be focusing on the streamers and wet flies today. Then next week, we'll be looking at nymphs, and then down the line, we'll be looking at dries. So here we go. The screen ticks over. Give me 1 sec. There we go. So essentially, we're fishing our lakes over here, be it land-based or from a boat. What rods do we want to be using? 6, 7, and 8 weights. It helps with casting. 10-foot rods help with a lot of things. Often we're fishing multi-fly rigs where we're going to have our flies spaced apart a reasonable distance. And one of my favorite, and we'll talk about leaders down the line, one of my favorite leader setups has 2 flies 10 foot apart. And if you want to have your leaders, if you want to have flies, say 10 foot apart, or say you're traveling to Tasmania and you're fishing 3 flies 5 foot apart, if you don't have a 10-foot rod, it's very hard to land the fish because the fly's going to get caught in the top of the guide. So the length helps with control, it helps with casting, it helps with a lot of things. I use all 6, 7, and 8 weight rods, and the more I'm fishing, the more I'm starting to use 8 weights. They deliver the flies better. Ultimately, our rod is just a lever. And when we're streamer and wet fly fishing, we're pointing our rod at the flies, and everything is happening through our hands, what we do with our hands. So I know that the tip's not that soft, it's a bit faster, but it helps with the delivery of the flies and efficiency and all of that kind of thing. But again, we'll talk about that later on. What lines are we going to be using? Again, we'll go into it in more detail. Floating, sink tip, intermediate, full sinking lines. That's pretty much what we want. My lines, I pretty much match them to the rod. I don't overweight or underline or any of that sort of thing. I just think if I'm using a 7 weight, I like a 7 weight line. We are using tapered leaders. Now that's something you're going to do more likely if you're land-based. 3, 4X, that sort of zone's perfect. And again, we'll talk later, but I like to cut them down. If you have a 9-foot leader out of the pack, I don't want to tie the whole thing on, but we'll talk about that later. You're going to cut it down and shorten it for your efficiency and for ease of fishing. Straight fluorocarbon is typically what I fish, especially out of a boat or if the wind's behind you anywhere, because you've typically got weighted flies or flies with a bit of bulk, and they're going to turn over with the power of the line anyway. And then tip it to your liking. So the big 3 keys to success when it comes to lake fishing are on the screen there. Finding the right location, finding the depth, and finding the retrieve. If you don't have these 3 things, if they aren't all in your favor and you haven't got those sorted, you can't catch a fish. And you'll see at the bottom there, I've put how the flies are relevant if they're not in the picture, because you could have the world's greatest fly and the fly that's fishing the best on that lake at the moment. But if you're fishing in the right location, fishing the right retrieve, but are at the wrong depth, you're not going to catch them. So I love flies more than anyone. And we were talking about it before the presentation about my fly tying videos. I love flies, but they are so not important unless those 3 things are sorted out. So they're the focus. And then after you've got those sorted out, that's when the fly starts to play a big role. But there's no point having the best fly if you're in the wrong location or you're at the wrong depth or you've got the wrong retrieve. So just if you were to take anything out of today's presentation, take a photo or a screenshot of that slide, because that is the key. So you get to a lake, what are you looking for? You haven't fished a venue before. Where do you start? That's one of the hardest things. I've got them listed there, so I won't run through them because they're quite self-explanatory, but wind, windward shores, the structure, current, wind lanes, foam. That's very applicable if there's food on top. But as I've got there, current's really important. We don't think of the lakes as having current, but bait fish get buffeted around and food gets buffeted around by the wind. It's very big in bass fishing in America, and it's something we don't think about much with trout fishing, but current in a lake is super important as to where the bait goes and then where the food goes, and particularly stocked fish. Stocked fish get pushed around by the current and they just go the path of least resistance and often end up in a bay on the windward shore, for example. And at the bottom there, I've got any change. You're looking for anything that's different. A great example of that is Tantangra Dam, in New South Wales, where they have a lot of soaks. And when the wind pushes onto them, you get that nice kind of dirty, muddy stain rolling off the bank and then meeting the clear water. And those spots are absolute hot spots. So like, just look for anything is the key, really. And if you run through all of these things throughout a day, you're going to find them somewhere. That photo on the side there, that's Jonathan Stagg from the Australian team and I. We fished Little Pine Lagoon in Tassie from a boat in practice for the Worlds, and we were struggling until we pushed onto a windward shore down up near the river arm, and then the fish were just tight on the shore, tight on the windward shore. You see, I've got a photo of me there. I hopped out of the boat because we had to land that fish from the shore. So, I mean, you got to roll. If you're not catching them, move, because the fish are going to be somewhere. I put this slide in. That's Lake Purrumbete in winter. I caught some fish in this drift, and I'll show you why in a second. But like I've got at the top there, it's not about where you start. People always go, they get in a tiz or they get confused and stressed about where they're going to fish. It doesn't matter, because where you start is typically never where you finish. So start somewhere and it'll all unfold for you. And what I've got here, I'll go back a slide. This situation here, we've got some nice reeds and weed there, and then we've got a drop off. And if I shoot forwards, that's me driving over it with the sounder after I fished it. And you can see we've got the ledge, the drop off, we've got the weed bed coming up, and then the fish sitting just off the edge of it. So you got to imagine that's what's happening under the water where you are. So again, just remember, fish are always seeing your flies. They're always there. You've just got to find them or find fish that are active and want to eat. And a lot of that can be what we're talking about in the next slides. Because if you look at the depth there, that's meters down the right. A lot of those fish are at 2 to 3 meters. So you're not really going to catch those on an intermediate or a tight 3. You're probably going to have to go down. Perfect segue into depth. In fly fishing on a lake, we typically achieve depth with our fly line. And hopefully, I'm just looking at my other monitor here. Hopefully that slide clears up for you. But our fly line and our fly choice is how we achieve depth. Yes, a weighted bead on the end of a fly does help a little bit with depth, but generally it's the fly line. So as I said earlier, we've got a few different types. Floating line, it floats. We've got a sink tip, which is a floating line with a sinking tip that may be 5 feet, 10 feet, 15 feet, something like that. We've got intermediate fly lines. An intermediate line sinks at about 1.5 inches per second there, as you see on screen. Now, you may see on the market there are fast sinking intermediates or slow sinking intermediates. Fast intermediates can go anywhere up to 2 to 3 inches per second. And slow ones like hovers will be 0.5 of an inch per second in their sink rate. And then we've got our full sinking lines. So if you ever see a line on the market that is called a DI3 or a type 3, that 3 means 3 inches per second. So that line's sinking at 3 inches per second. If you see a line that's marketed as a seek or a sweep line, that is a line that, say it's a 5 sweep. The middle of that will sink at 5 inches per second. And a normal sinking line will sink like this. It'll sink down and then you fish it back up. A sweep line is non-density compensated. So there's more weight in the belly than at the top, like at both ends. The running line and the head section. So when you cast that line, the belly is going to sink more and your flies and your line fishes in a sweep. So sweep lines, I really like them if I'm fishing, if I don't know what depth the fish are at, because it fishes quite a range of depths. Very good if you're drifting onto a shore, you can kind of fish down the ledge really nicely. But hopefully that gives you an idea of what our fly lines are and how a fly line helps you achieve depth. because it's all about what line you choose. That's our use of, that's effectively our sinker. That's our way of getting down. Now, and sorry, I hope I'm not going too fast, but remember, if you've got questions, write them down, because the best way is for us to flesh more of this stuff out after with some questions. So I've got here the retrieve and 3 stages of the presentation. Now, I really like to think of my lake fishing as having 3 stages of every cast. So, and I've got a video to show you after this slide, so that might help you out. So 3 stages. We've got the drop. So let's exclude the casting motion. After we've cast our flies and our line and our flies have hit the water, the first stage of our cast is the drop. That's where our flies are falling down, and where we're letting our line sink. Very important. You catch a lot of fish on the drop, which react to the fly landing or just seeing the food falling down. It could be a dead bait fish or a nymph or anything, but the drop is very important. A lot of people cast and then just start stripping back straight away. You do want to fish the drop to some degree. And how do we do that? If you're on the bank, cast out, you can just stay tight to your flies and let it sink. If you're in the boat and you're drifting, you'll need to cast out, and then I'd probably retrieve. I do it with a figure 8, but retrieve really slowly at the same speed as your boat is drifting. And that way you're tight to your flies while your flies are sinking. So you've got, oh, didn't mean to go there. Then we've got the retrieve. The retrieve, it can be strips. It can be 2-handed roly-poly like this. It can be a figure 8. There's a lot of different retrieves. You can mix up the pace throughout the retrieve, as you'll see in the next slide, but very important. Then we've got the lift and hang. That's when our flies start to send up, come to the surface, and just before we pick them up to recast, you want to stop your rod and hang them. There's nothing worse than someone going strip, 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 and then they lift their flies up and go whip, and then cast it out again, because a fish that's followed them up as they're rising, if you stop your rod, stop your flies, the fly will sit there and often the fish will swim over the top of it and eat it, or sit there and look at it and then decide to eat it. But if you just rip it out straight away, you're not giving the fish the chance to eat it that have chased it to the boat and wanted to stop or do something else. So you'll see that in the video as well. And, you know, throughout a season, I reckon I would probably catch 1/3 of my fish on each of these retrieves. And some days you might catch 80% of your fish on the drop, right on the drop. Sometimes you might catch them all on the hang. So you've got to make sure you give each stage of the cast, of the presentation, a good amount of time, because on certain days they want certain presentations and different stages. All right, let's have a look at this video here. So hopefully that video came through nicely. I think it played smoothly enough for you to get the picture, but 3 stages: the drop when the flies are falling, the retrieve. As you can see, you can mix up the pace, you can speed it up, slow it down, stop it halfway through, and then at the end, that lift, and then stop and hang at the end. So like a must, just you've got to do it. So yeah, again, you can ask me questions later about that kind of thing, and we can always rewatch the video at the end if you like. So we're going to talk now about leaders. So I guess before we go on, now we've pretty much talked about those 3 points at the start. We've talked about the location, finding that right location. We've talked about the depth of the fish, which is critical. We achieve the depth by our fly lines, maybe the weight of the nymph sometimes, or weight of the fly if we're fishing a floating line. And then thirdly, we've got the retrieve, which we just covered there, and the speed of the retrieve, the type, all of that kind of thing. So they're the 3 keys. Now we can move on to the other stuff. Before we go to flies, leader setup and efficiency is really important. We're going to talk about our leader setups in a second. Very, very briefly, I point out, because they're also that it's, you know, your leader it's all up to the individual. So it's a very personal thing. But the most important thing you should remember is that efficiency is key. You want to keep your flies in the water. You don't want to have your leader too long or too complicated or too long of droppers or too many droppers if you're going to tangle and then your flies aren't going to be in the water. The most important thing is for your fly, every cast, to be hitting the water. Because if you're fishing 1 or 2 flies and you make sure every cast lands out and lands straight and you're tight to your fly straight away, you're in with a chance. No matter how badly you're fishing or the fishing is, if your fly line and your leader and everything turns over straight and you're tight and in contact with your flies, you're in with a chance. So that is the most important thing. So you just want to stay in the water as long as you can. You don't want to be undoing a tangle when the fish turn on or a fish would have swum past your fly. So there, I've got to fish comfortably in your way, and you'll do better doing that than trying to overcomplicate it and be super fancy and do what someone else has recommended that you should do. So again, we'll talk about leaders later. I'm sure there'll be questions about it, but this is a typical leader setup in Victoria for me. With 2 flies, now in Tasmania, you can fish 3 flies. So 3 flies 5 foot apart is fantastic. But I want to make sure I at least have 5 feet between my flies, this form of fishing. And ideally, I want to space them out as realistically as possible, as far as possible, because that means when they do land and they're fishing on the drop, I'm covering more water, kind of more of a zone. So if I can, I like to have my 2 flies 10 foot apart. But obviously in the calm, in certain conditions, depending on casting, that's not realistic. So try to have at least 5 feet between your flies. You'd rather have the distance between your flies than between your fly and the fly line, because, and you look at John Horsey, some of you may have heard of him or read some of his work from the UK. He's one of the best lake anglers in the world. And he reckons that with stockfish, you can fish your top fly 3 foot from the fly line, because they can't comprehend it, they don't care, and they see the fly. So don't worry about fishing too close to your fly line. And if you look at Victoria, we have a lot of stocked fish. Especially if you're fishing in slightly off-coloured water or in really windy conditions, they don't really care about our fly line. Like, we're pulling our fly line past them all the time. So just make sure you're fishing those 2 flies a nice distance apart and getting them to land. So there's a good example there. We've got that little drawing I've done. We've got 6 feet from our fly line to our first fly. We've got a dropper tied on a triple surgeons, tied with the triple surgeons. And then we've got another 6 feet or 10 feet, depending on how comfortable you are casting, to my point fly. Now, in the boat, and I think this will be the next slide, I think I preempted it. In the boat, I like to fish straight fluorocarbon. That's because in a boat, when you're drifting, the wind's behind you, so it's going to help your flies turn over. Land-based, sometimes you have to fish into the wind, or in no wind, or any of that. So sometimes a tapered lead is helpful just to kick over your flies. So if you're only fishing 6 feet from your fly line to your first fly, and you buy a 9 foot tapered leader out of the pack, obviously that's not going to work. So what I would do in that scenario is I would cut, say, maybe 3 feet off or 2 feet off the butt section of our tapered leader we've bought out of the pack, and then maybe cut off 2 or 3 feet at the front end. So then you're only using, say, 4 foot, if that adds up. I wasn't thinking about what I was saying. You might only be using a 4 foot of your tapered leader just to help kick over your line, because realistically our fly lines have a taper and they have so much power in them. Like, we don't really need, in the calm, you don't need a tapered leader to turn your flies over. There's enough power transferring from the fly line into your fluorocarbon or your mono to actually kick it over. So, but just something to think about. So yeah, here we are. Considerations if you're land-based. If you're land-based, often you're in the calm or you've got the wind in your face. Say the fish are on the windward shore because you can't catch them on the lee shore where the wind's blowing off. You might have to go to the windward shore to catch them. And if you've got to get out there, sure, a tapered leader is going to help, because that's going to help punch and turn your flies over. Now, sink tip lines are fantastic for fishing from the bank, because sometimes a lot of our Victorian lakes, we're going to wade out. And if you need to get down a little bit, you're fishing off a ledge and you're fishing a full sinking line. When you strip your line, the first thing that's going to happen, it's going to sink down, and then inevitably that fly line always hooks around that little loop of ours on our gravel guard on our waders and annoys the hell out of us, or it gets stuck on a twig or in the weed. If you have a sink tip fly line, you can have a sink tip and a floating running line, so the sink tip will sink, and then when you strip your running line, like the floating part of your line onto the water, it'll sit high on the water, and then when you pick up and recast, it shoots out beautifully, doesn't get caught on your shoes, doesn't get caught on the twigs on the bottom. So good consideration. And then finally, you may want to think about slightly more aggressive fly lines. So fly lines with more weight, a shorter head section built into the front that'll actually shoot and cast further with less of a back cast, because a lot of the time there's trees behind us, we don't have room behind us. So you may only have, say, 30 foot of back cast to cast 60 feet. And that's a lot easier with a more aggressive fly line that'll shoot line, and because that head will really carry your running line and your flies forward. So just something to think about. The fun part, flies. Just gonna have a sip of water. So for the most part, I mean, woolly buggers and marabou style streamers are just so good. They are so good. And as you can see there, they're old photos, but that's on the left there, you'll see my fly boxes. It's pretty much, there's a lot of marabou there because they work so well. Two main colors I like are olive and black. Brown is also really good. And then you want to have some colored options in there as well. But I mean, we'll talk and I'll field questions on flies later because there inevitably will be some. Really, if you only had 3 flies to go out and fish Victorian lakes, I would take a black woolly bugger, a brown woolly bugger. Actually, I'll give myself 4. A black, a brown, an olive, and a coral, like these ones I've got here. But we'll go into those later. But other flies it's worth having, you can see down the bottom there, I've got a booby, I've got a Tom Jones, a stick caddis, a claret dabbler, a blob, all very good options to put on the dropper just to mix it up in case the fish don't want to eat big. And then on the right, I've got some Yetis. I've got Bilbeck's Green Machine and Crystal Cat that I've tied there. Really nice flies because they provide a different profile to your marabou woolly buggers, and they are very good flies. Now, don't be afraid of coloured flies. Bright flies, they catch them, particularly, pretty much autumn, winter, and spring. Like woolly buggers are fantastic here on the mainland. They're fantastic all year round. And our trout just love, like, as I said before, most of them are stocked. They may be old, but they are stocked fish. You look at all of our lakes like Ballarat, Wendouree. You've got Lake Purrumbete, Lake Bullen-Merri. Like all of those fisheries have no natural recruitment. So Tolondo is another one, Lake Fines. All of those fisheries have no natural recruitment. So those fish have been stocked in there, and stocked fish just love colour. So I'll always have a coral option on my line. You can see the fly there in the bottom right, and that caught that whopping 60 centimetre brown on the left there. It just catches big fish, and it's a fly that I'll always tie on. Like I'll never come off the water on a day of fishing in Victoria where I'm streamer or wet fly fishing, where that fly won't have been on for a period of time. I love coral, but remember, it doesn't necessarily have to be coral. I've got a very good friend, Leuben Pfeiffer. He just won the Commonwealth Championships in New Zealand. When he fishes these Victorian lakes, and he wins a lot of comps as well, he loves fishing a pink woolly bugger. So coral isn't necessarily the answer. The answer is a colour. So it could be coral, it could be pink, it could be orange. But the key is just to have that bright option that just seems to make our fish angry or just gets them to eat when they're not interested in eating those natural colours. Now, there are some times of the year where it's not about woolly buggers and streamer fishing. It's a small window, but it's not always about it. If you're not catching them on your woolly buggers because it's really calm and glassed out, like there's no wind on the water, or the water's really clear, or there's a few mayflies starting to hatch, like in that transition period into when the mayflies start on us on some of our lakes, you may want to look to some smaller fly options. You can see there on the left, I've got some Zulus, Cape McLarens, mallard and claret. There's a claret dabbler through there. There's some hare's-ear spiders and some crunches, all of that stuff. You may want to look at fishing some smaller flies if the bigger stuff's not working for you because you think the fish are honed in on some of those smaller food sources. Or if it's not working, that's time when you should look at another technique, such as nymphing. So again, as I said, that'll be part 2 to this presentation, which we'll do next week, talking about a completely different technique. So, but just remember, you can incorporate some of these small flies into this, these sort of techniques. And we made it through. So, I mean, a lot of the stuff I've talked about, if you're looking for tying flies, or you're looking for videos to kind of watch me fish or elaborate on that, there's a good video on my YouTube channel of me fishing Rocky Valley Reservoir where I'm doing all of those techniques we just talked about. And yeah, if you're interested in any guiding, anything like that, check out my website there, tomjarmanfishing.com, and check out Driftwater in Tasmania if you're interested in going down there. We'll go to some questions, but before we do, actually, I might jump out of this because I'll show you just some core flies I think you should have, which I put together for tonight. All right, so some flies I would highly recommend having are these ones here. Now, I'm not sure how clear that is, but you can see I've got a coral woolly-bugger, a brown damsel, I've got an olive woolly-bugger, and I've got a black woolly-bugger with a red bead. And then at the bottom here, I've got a wet English hopper, a dewberry, a Cape McLaren, and a bibio.
Sorry, Tom, to interrupt.
Yeah.
For everybody who's new to Zoom, if you click from speaker view to gallery view or switch that across, then you'll get Tom in a bigger screen than a whole lot of other small people. So I don't know if it's going to help people, but it might make it a bit easier to see that screen again.
Yeah, cool. But yeah, essentially, if I had to take only a handful of flies anywhere, these would be the ones. They cover a lot of bases. They've got my small fly options there. They've got my colored flies. Like, they're going to work in a range of conditions on a range of lakes. So, as I said, it's not all about the flies. I love flies. They're my favorite part of it. But the big takeaway are those 3 things I spoke about: location, retrieve, and depth. They're your big factors. So, thank you. I might grab a glass of water. But questions, please pop them along the side in the group chat there, and I can kind of sift through them and just ask anything. I always say to people, ask now while you've got me or you've got anyone there, because asking questions is how you learn.
I can kick one off for you, Tom, while you're having a drink. I actually posted it to you. And the question was, does the fly pattern somewhat dictate the speed of your retrieve?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Yeah, it does. If you're fishing, like, bigger flies tend to fish better moved faster, like, and vice versa. If you're fishing some really small flies like this, you typically aren't going to rip them really quickly and pull them really fast. Typically, if you're fishing a small fly, you're going to fish it at more of a medium pace or slightly slower. If you're fishing a really big fly, you're going to pull it and you're going to be stripping it quite quickly. Because if you're fishing a big fly like this, like, we call them woolly buggers, or like, we think they look like damsels or bayfish or whatever, but really they're just lures, so that we're using them to lure the trout. We want to excite them, effectively just like a guy throwing a Tassie devil, just cranking it back. Yeah, they are lures ultimately. So
cool.
Yeah, does that answer that question, Andrew?
Yeah, thanks, mate. That was good.
And on that, I'll elaborate on that. Often, if you're fishing at small fish, you want to fish a slightly smaller fly, because if you're fishing massive flies at small fish, it works, but they typically eat a smaller fly slightly more confidently. So just another consideration overlapping on that one.
Tom?
Yes.
Yeah. Thank you very much. You've given us some great insights into some secrets, I think. I don't know, they're secrets or whatever. A couple of questions.
Mm-hmm.
I'll start with the first one, and then I'll leave it from there. In competition fly fishing in the World Championships recently,
Mm-hmm.
I believe that most of the fish in the lakes were caught on sinking lines. Is that true, correct, whatever?
Yeah, 100%.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was pretty much all about, for the most part, it was all about the bigger streamers because we had really rough conditions. We didn't have mayfly around, and the water was slightly off color, so it lent itself to fishing bigger. There's a really good video, actually, Barney, on, and this is really funny, and it's something we should all look at, just to, because we all go, oh, it's about the fly, and I love this fly because it's got a little collar and it's a little bit fancy like this. The French won the World Championships, and Gregoire Jugelet, I think I pronounced his name wrong, but Gregoire put a video up of the French team's Tasmania woolly bugger, and he ties it in a video. I'm not sure whether he works for JMC. It got linked to me by someone. But he ties the Tasmania woolly bugger, and it is a black tail with a black body with a black hackle, and I think it's a black bead. So it's really funny to look at that because we all get super complicated, and then they came over and I think, won it with that. They did have a little bit of, I think it was black holographic in the tail for Flash, but the plainest fly. So it's a really good, lesson for all of us.
Okay, thanks, Tom.
No worries. So next we had, I'm just gonna have to scroll up. Best way to catch smelting fish. Smelting fish is a hard one. If you get fishing at smelting fish, I typically fish dams. Like I fish lures at them effectively. Won a lot of sessions on Tolondo on smelting fish. One with my dad in the boat, and I actually fished a Shrek, and I fished a Shrek, red-beaded black woolly bugger, and a coral. But it was purely about the smelting fish, which were up, wanted to chase because they're aggressive. And it was purely about speed and getting the fly in front of them, not so much the fly. So that's hard, but smelting fish, people go, oh yeah, I like my smelt pattern, or I like this, or they bust through the bait and then they come around and mop them up. So you want to land your fly and let it drift through them. There's a lot of theories going around out there, but I think ultimately, if you can get your fly in front of one of those fish that's moving and pull it and excite him, they eat it. So, and bright coral, pinks, they work on smelting fish because the fish are just active and they want to feed. So you just got to get it in front of them. Yeah. Thanks, Frank, for the compliment. That was good. Could I repeat the core flies, please? Yeah. Do you want the slide or do you want these ones that I held up? Whomever that was.
Ones you held up.
Yeah, sure. Hang on, let me just pop them back in. Yeah.
We also missed your question, Bill.
Did I?
About the boat.
All right, it's coming up.
Yeah, no worries.
Hey, Bill, just behave yourself there now.
Just that. And if I talk, my screen will pop up.
Yeah.
That's them. That's them there. I can make him.
Now, what were the bottom ones?
The bottom ones, we've got an English hopper there. I tie that in a YouTube video, actually. Then we've got a Dewberry, which is a Scottish traditional, like UK lock style fly. We've got a Cape McLaren, which is another one there, and then a Bibio.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
They look quite small, Tom. Are they like a size 14?
Yeah, these are all 14s at the bottom here.
Right.
They're all 14s, and these top ones are all around that 12 to 10 mark. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So what length do you set your dropper at for the top fly in a 2-fly rig? Yeah. So, I mean, I reckon how long is that? So 10 inches, you don't, oh gosh, I'm not, that 20 centimeters actually, sorry, is the maximum. That's what that is. 20 centimeters is the maximum I'd have. Ideally, if you can get it around that, 15 centimeter, 10 centimeter mark, that's perfect. But you want to start with them a little bit longer so that you have some fly changes in you. Now, it's also worth noting that if you're fishing heavier tippet, you can fish a longer dropper without it spinning and tangling. If you're fishing finer tippet, you're going to have to fish a shorter dropper without it tangling, because the finer tippet will tangle and half hitch around itself more. So if you're fishing, say, with 10 pound, you can have your leader, you can have your dropper longer than if you're fishing with just, say, 5 pound, for example. Say 5 pound 4x or 6, 5x, 4x, 5x, that sort of zone. Yeah. Does that answer that one, Paul? Wherever Paul is.
Yes, it does. Thank you.
No worries.
Perfect.
Yeah, so Bill Jackson, your question is, do you do the lift from the boat? Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, your flies are gonna lift in some way, to some degree. Whether you're on a floating line on the bank or a sink tip on the bank, they're gonna lift up at some point. So every cast, you really need to go strip, lift, and then hang.
It was actually about shore fishing. It was actually about shore fishing. Do you lift on the shore fishing as well?
100%. It doesn't actually change. Yeah, the mechanics of everything, because even if you're on the shore, your flies will be lifting at some degree in the water column. So, yeah, unless you're fishing, your flies will somehow miraculously floating. Yeah, yeah. There's going to be some degree of lift.
Thank you.
Steve, you've asked, what do you mean by an aggressive fly line from the bank on a lake? Can you give an example? Yeah, I can. So there's a lot of them. There are a lot of them out there. An aggressive fly line's one that has a faster head section. The ones I have are Cortland line FO techs. So they're like the old, you might have heard of the 40 plus lines by Airflow. They're the same factor. They've got like a 30-foot aggressive head section. So instead of like the length of the taper being, say, 60 foot, like a nice progressive long head section, they're concentrated right into the front, so it punches. Another one, Steve, is the compact intermediate, which I use. It's called a compact intermediate because it's got all the weight built to the head. So it means you can cast it further with less false casts, ultimately. So it's the same. I'll extrapolate here. If you're streamering on a river, you want a fly line that has a very short head section that's very aggressive, because that way you can cast it a long way with very little line out on your back cast. Because naturally on a river, you've got trees or something behind you. And that's why people, spay cast. They like fish a spay rod or a Skagit line or something like that. So it's the exact same principle. If you have a more aggressive fly line, you can cast it further and shoot more line with less line out on your back cast. Does that answer that, Steve?
Yep, thank you.
Good question, Mark, Mr. Youngman. What is the main advantage of a sweep versus a straight line for everyone? I don't know the answer to that, Mark. That's a hard question. I mean, they do fish differently through the water column. A conventional sinking line will fish like this. A conventional sweep line will fish like this. Now that is if you're fishing unweighted flies. If you're fishing weighted flies with a sink line, it's naturally going to affect the sweep. So with the flies we use, I don't actually know how much a sweep line sweeps, but ultimately it has a different sink rate to other, it has a different sink rate and it behaves differently. The thing I love about sweep lines is they cast so well. Like they're the nicest casting sinking lines on the market. They're just absolutely beautiful to fish. So that's the reason I like them. A 5 Seek is by Cortland's one of my favorite sinking lines because it's just amazing to cast and it's just really easy to fish. And it fishes at that it sinks at 4 to 5 inches per second. So just remember, like a sinking line, a sweep line that sinks at 5 inches per second is going to sink slower than a conventional straight sinking line that sinks at 5 inches per second. So I think you do hit a different depth, Mark, is probably the best answer I can give you. That was terrible. I just dodged your question though.
Thanks.
No worries. But I will point out, as actually going back to Mark's question, one issue you sometimes have with sweep lines is if you're losing a lot of fish, I would change from a sweep line to a conventional line because they're like this in the water, you don't have as much direct contact to them. So sometimes it can be a reason for your hooks not driving in, or like it's just different. So a lot of the time, if I'm losing a lot of fish or missing a lot of fish, and I'm fishing a sweep line, I'll change to a conventional line, and that often fixes the problem for me because I'm like tighter, fishing more directly at my flies rather than having a big belly in the water that kind of puts a little bit of slack or stretch and give into the line.
I used that advice on Saturday at Four Springs, Tom, and yeah, didn't lose hardly any compared to Little Pine a few weeks ago where I lost heaps.
Yeah, it causes problems, but then it can do the flip side for some. If you have small fish, or you sometimes have, like, it can kind of hold fish on because you have the belly sinking. It kind of holds, sometimes it holds them down. Like on Rocky Valley, I almost wonder if sometimes fishing a sweep line, because the fish are small, it stops them jumping as much because you're hooking them and you've got a lot of belly and that resistance in the water. It kind of keeps them down a little bit for you. I don't know, but
Hey, Mark,
it's
you
different.
lucky. Can I just say, you lucky bugger?
Yeah, well, we hadn't been out for a while, and there was only 3 boats on Four Springs, and yeah, the fish were good. They're all pretty much 2 to 3 pounds and in fantastic condition.
Okay.
And yeah, so that's,
I know the area well, so hey, good luck. I love it.
What's the weed like down there at the moment, Mark?
it's dying off and it's clearing up.
That's
Yeah,
good.
so the bottom end in front of the car park's no good.
Yeah.
We fished down there a little bit, but it wasn't any good. But the up from the dead trees in the water, right up the lake to the dam and up the top end.
Yeah.
It's a lot better fishing water up there. And the fish were on tiny snails and water boatmen and little shrimps. That's what they were eating. But there was a dun hatch there Wednesday a week ago, a guy was saying, big dun hatch there.
There you go. All right. Windy day adjustments to fly numbers, lines, leaders, rods. What sort of changes do you make on the fly? That's a whole nother talk. So, I mean, if it's really windy, you're more prone to getting tangles naturally. So reducing your fly numbers can help that. If it's windier, I'm more inclined to fish an 8-weight rather than a 7-weight or a 6-weight. It does help. Fishing a slightly heavier rod and heavier line will actually get your, it'll hold its own in the wind a little more. So it does make it easier to present. That's one of the reasons I love an 8-weight in general, is because fishing an 8-weight with 7-weight lines, the rod tip doesn't flex as much, so it doesn't get buffeted around by the wind and get affected by it. So I have a lot of control. Sort of changes do you make on the fly? If it's really windy and really rough, I'd typically upsize my fly. It's a hard question because it's going to be different on all sorts of lakes. Because some lakes you'd go, if it's windy, you'd go, well, I'm just going to get out of the wind. Sometimes you're going to go, sometimes you want to, be in the wind and you'll up your fly size and maybe up the bead on your fly. And yeah, that's a really hard question. Does that kind of answer it a little bit for you? Yeah, you're muted. Can we unmute Mario there? I can't hear you there. Hang on. Andrew, are you able to?
Yeah, I'm here. Who do you want me to unmute?
Oh, there.
That's
We've got
okay.
it.
Oh, sorry.
I'm right now.
Yeah.
Yes, Tom. If you're fishing in a competition and you've got 3 flies on and it's windy, it's buggery, and you're tangling, do you go down to 2 or 1? Or do you keep 3 on?
I'd book some casting practice. I would go down to 2. Yeah, it's the balance of the efficiency factor. Yeah. So yeah, but I can't stress how like important casting is. Really, like, from a certain level, it doesn't matter for me. I have a very weird view on casting. I don't care how ugly someone's cast is or anything about it, so long as the flies land out and go bang like that. The fish doesn't see how the flies get there. They don't judge anything to do with the cast. They only see the presentation. So yeah, it's all just about finding a way to get them there. And if you can't get the 3 flies there, get the 2 flies there, and then you go down. But I mean, heavier rods does help that. Fishing a heavier or faster action rod, I find does help that for me. So, yeah.
Cool. Thank you.
Coral and pink woolly buggers are great in Vic. They're fantastic on wild stock trout in New Zealand. Yes, they are. Oh, it's you, Gary. Do they work in Tassie? Yeah. Yeah, they do. Penstock. Yeah, they do. So, you know, Brian Hughes caught like 5 on Pine, won nationals on coral. It's not that good, but if you get really filthy weather, they are good. Like they're really good on Highland waters, where we've got the stocked fish factor. So if you think about, and they're good on penstock. So if you were to break down all the Tassie lakes, which have those combinations of trout, like they have a combination of wild browns and then supplemented stocked rainbows and some relocated browns, you would think, I know they work on, coral does work on Four Springs. So suddenly we're talking about all lakes that have a combination of stocked rainbow and brown trout. So the lakes, I would assume that they would work. So I haven't tried them on these two. They should work on Lake Leak and on Tombs Lake out on the East Coast. But anywhere where you have the combination of stocked browns stocked rainbows and relocated browns, yeah, it does work. Yeah, so, and it works on Arthurs, but not that well. That's the problem. But penstock in filthy weather, fantastic. Yeah.
Right, cool.
I would be more inclined, you know, yeah. I'll extrapolate that. In the filthy weather, the coral and pink woolly buggers. In the calm weather, the coral and pink and orange blobs. Yeah, that would be the flip side of it. What about night fishing? Which you most do, Marshall? I'm the world's worst night fisherman. I'm also the worst morning fisherman because I don't wake up in time. Look, night fishing, I think, I haven't done the Lumo stuff, so I can't comment. I've seen it work, but what I can comment on towards night fishing is fishing in low light, because it's effectively the same thing, and fishing really deep, where there's very little visibility. And it's all about silhouette, and it's all about movement and bulk in the fly. So if I was fishing at night, I probably wouldn't really bother fishing any color other than a black fly, because anything you're going to fish is going to be dark anyway. So I'd fish dark flies, I'd fish big, because you want to move water. A lot of night, it depends on the time of year you're doing your night fishing, but a lot of the time in the night, if the moon's out, I'd want to fish high in the water or fish shallow. I don't want to fish like in low light. Typically, you don't want to fish super deep. Low light, typically, the fish are looking to feed. It's the same example in dirty water on rivers. If somewhere's really dirty, you typically don't want to fish deep. You want to fish high where the light penetrates a little bit, because even at night, there's a little bit of light there. So big and black and stay high in the water and stay shallow would be my answer to that one. Are cloudy days better than bright days for lakes? No. So they're different. You're going to fish them differently. A great example is, and different flies are going to work on them. A great example, Lake Purrumbete, in the bright, blobs are fantastic. But I haven't found them to be terribly great in the cloudy weather. So it's hard, because some lakes fish really well in the bright and some lakes fish really poorly in the overcast. A great example is, and this is, I'll use the Tassie example, my experience from guiding, but if you have a bright day, typically you lean towards lakes with rocks in them. So you move towards lakes like Great Lake, the 19 Lagoons. You look at Arthur's to a degree. Arthur's kind of the in-between one. But you look to lakes that are rockier more than weedy. And on the cloudy days, Lake Augusta is another one. On the cloudy days, you look to those weedy lakes. So your penstocks, your little pines, your Lake Adas, your Four Springs. Because if it's bright on a weedy lake, often if there's not a reason for the fish to be up, they're going to be down in the weed. So yeah, I think it's a little bit to do with lake choice, but typically if it's bright, I like to fish, I slow down a little bit. I fish a little bit slower. I fish a little bit smaller. yeah, does that answer that one? That's a really hard one because from season to season it changes. So yeah, that's a really tough question. How far do you need to cast away from the boat? Not far is the answer to that. But you want to be able to cast far enough so that you can cast, have them sink, and then be able to retrieve them back and hang. So you don't want to cast so short that you only have 4 or 5 strips and then you're done. So, I mean, if you can try and cast 60 feet is ideal. I don't actually think you really want to cast that much longer than that a lot of the time in a boat. If you don't have to, I wouldn't, because you're going to lose control of, and you're not going to have very good contact. But if you can try, if you can try and cast that 50 to 60 feet sort of zone, that's really nice. If you're fishing high in the water, you're fishing an intermediate or floating line, you don't need to cast that far at all. You could cast shorter probably, maybe even 40 feet, because you can retrieve almost straight away because you're not relying on your fly line sinking down. But if you need to fish deep, naturally you have to cast further to allow the flies to go down while your boat's drifting on them and then retrieve. So yeah, that's kind of a hard one. Does that answer that, Leslie? You're muted there. Thumbs up or thumbs down? Oh, yeah,
yes, thank you.
yeah. Is there a follow up, or is that all? Does that cover that well enough?
No, that covers it. Thank you.
No worries. Marshall, what about boobies and sinking lines? That's a hard one because I don't do a lot of fishing with boobies, and they work. They do work, and I've caught fish on boobies. They seem to do, and I've caught more fish on boobies away from Australia than I have in Australia, probably, like New Zealand or the UK, or Slovakia or America. Like I've actually caught more fish on boobies elsewhere. And I think rainbows really like boobies. They cast a completely different shape in the water, but I don't find them to be that good in Australia. And a great example is, like, we talk about we need to be doing more things and we need to be fishing and innovating and trying these things. And a lot of the reason we don't always use boobies and we don't always use buzzers as a fly pattern is because they don't work that well. Because if you could, like, you can tie on a Shrek on a lake and chuck it out and pull it back and bang, you've got one. But you can go out, or you can really, like flies like boobies, you often have to really force and try to make work. And if that's the case, then they're probably not the right option for that lake. So, yeah, I mean, they definitely change one good thing a booby does is it does change the sink rate of a line for you because it keeps your flies up a little higher. That's a way you can use it. You can use it on a washing line, but yeah, I'm not a great booby fisherman. So, yeah, I hope I answered that well enough, but yeah, sorry, it was probably a pretty bad answer. Do you keep your fish nets hanging in my room? Andrew, those are nets. I had a client who fished with me in Japan. I had 3 Japanese clients, and they left me some handmade nets from some Japanese woods over there, which they made. And then they invited me over to Japan and flew me across to fish with them on some of their rivers and do some dry fly fishing. And when I got there, they had made me, because I love the net so much, they made me another smaller one and engraved my name into the wood. So they're a memento. Yeah.
Please don't tell me it was tenkara.
No, I know. I don't like tenkara fishing, but I do have tenkara rods. Yeah. Japan is one of the best fisheries in the world, hands down, one of the best fisheries in the world.
Don't cut him off, Andrew.
Andrew.
Because he doesn't like tenkara, all right?
You're emasculated, Andrew, sorry.
Calm down, everybody.
Are you a tenkara fisherman?
I try to be.
I've got my tenkara rod right there.
Beautiful.
Yeah, I am going to try and do a YouTube video before the season ends on tenkara.
I'd love to see that.
Yeah. Yeah, the flies are good. Some tenkara flies are really good.
Mm-hmm.
Just imagine if you could fish them on a real rod.
Touche.
Is that Frank heading off? Frank, you said, oh, fishing net in the bedroom to catch these, very clever. Yeah. And now we're all up to jokes. So any more questions?
Yeah, I think we're winding up. Is anybody else want to say anything before we maybe close it down? Barney, would you like to say a couple of words?
Look, yeah, just a couple of things. Andrew, thanks for being the host and clicking on this. And thanks for Steve and for Frank, who started this a couple of weeks ago. We bought into the unlimited hours option on these things, which has been lovely. But tonight, I think we've shared, no, we haven't shared. Tom has shared with us some really, really good stuff that you just don't get unless you're talking to the man. So, Tom, thank you very much.
No, thank you, Barney.
Yes.
Yeah, it's an awesome initiative you guys are taking on. Yeah, to do this stuff. And it's the only way no one got, and I'm the same, no one improved or got anywhere on their own. And the only way you can improve is by asking questions and doing stuff like this, because no one, yeah, like all of the stuff I'm talking about, 95% of this probably isn't mine. It's stuff that you've gleaned off other people and encounters and experiences. So yeah, it's only kind of right to share it.